It's been 6 years since I lost half of it. Actually, 96% would be more accurate. That was back in March 2013. My company survived the Great Recession by a hair, but the flanking attack from my soon-to-be ex-wife proved too much for Octavian Orlov Inc. That was the name of the company I built from scratch and which no longer exists. My name is Daniel Orlov, by the way. Octavian became part of the name because I'm a big history buff. I also thought double O sounded good as an acronym. My parents immigrated to the United States from Eastern Europe before the Soviet Union collapsed. I was 7 years old at the time, my brother was 5, and my mom was pregnant with my sister. My parents came to the US on a tourist visa with less than $5,000 to give me and my siblings more opportunities and a chance at a better life. They didn't know the language and had no family or friends here, but that didn't discourage them. They felt they were pinned down and took a huge risk by moving to the United States. They burned all the bridges to their past and relative safety. I come from a family of risk takers. We had many years of financial struggle and hardship. For several years, we didn't get birthday and Christmas presents. Every morning, I saw my parents get up and leave for work, my father returning late in the evening and my mother in the middle of the day. At home, they were both well-educated people with relatively privileged professions. My father was a civil engineer, and my mother was a doctor. Their degrees and certificates had no value here, so they were happy to take on any job to support us. That we didn't receive gifts was not entirely true. The first Christmas, my brother and I each received a candy bar. I'll never forget it, probably until the day I die. I was heartbroken. We were so poor. Another thing I will never forget is the shame of being poor and different. In the town where we grew up, there were 2 middle schools and 1 high school. So kids from poor families were in the same classes as kids who seemed rich to me at the time. In reality, they were probably middle and upper middle class at best, with a few kids from families that today I would call more privileged. I still remember other kids making fun of me and my siblings for first wearing weird clothes, Eastern European, and then wearing things taken from the Goodwill store. I was ashamed of where I lived, in that small, cramped apartment, so I never invited any of the kids to visit or go to their homes for fear of having to reciprocate later. I dreaded the "what did you do on vacation" questions after summer and Christmas vacations. I didn't have stories about where we traveled, what cool things we saw and did to share with the class like the other kids did. Man, even though I was a very good student and loved going to school and learning, I dropped out of school at 15 to help support my impoverished family. By the age of 17, I had started my first business and was earning more than the combined income of both my parents. From that point on, I became the primary breadwinner for my family. By the age of 22, I had founded Octavian Orlov. By 25, I was married and had my first child. By then, I had finished paying for my brother's college education. He graduated with honors with a degree in mechanical engineering. I had also just started paying for my sister's college education. It took 7 years until she earned her Juris Doctor degree from a top 20 law school. I met Andrea when she came to work for me. She was 18 years old, fresh out of high school, and didn't have much work experience other than part-time jobs. She looked like an immigrant in financial difficulty, only it was just her and her mother in the family. Her father, a heavy drinker, had abandoned them when she was only 6 years old. When she applied to Double O, she struggled to find any meaningful work and worked as a hostess at a diner for minimum wage. When I hired her, she wasn't overqualified for the position, but I was imbued with her background and history and wanted to give her the opportunity to improve. She was smart and hardworking and did very well until she stopped working when she became pregnant with our son David. I got ahead of myself with that last sentence, didn't I? Yes, we dated, fell in love and married. I wasn't rich, but I was doing well by then. However, I had a lot of financial obligations. My father became disabled, and I provided all of my parents' income except for my father's disability insurance. When Andrea became pregnant, I was still paying for my sister's college tuition. With 3 families to support, a fledgling, fairly new business that required me to put as much profit into it as I could, we weren't on easy street. Yet we were doing well, especially for our age and humble origins. Let's move forward 10 years to early 2013. My company was already quite established. In almost every meaningful way, we had achieved the American dream. Double O had survived the first 5 years when over 80% of businesses fail, and had survived the Great Recession when many of my competitors had failed. In early January, my CFO and I estimated that the company was worth, at a conservative estimate, $50 million. A week later, I learned that Andrea was cheating on me. The moment I learned of Andrea's infidelity, I finally began to feel like I had it all worked out. Coming from a background of deprivation, shy of feeling different from the people I grew up around, I finally started to feel safe and felt like I belonged. I had a beautiful wife whom I adored, two wonderful children whom I loved more than life itself. Our daughter Sophia was born 2 years after David. Parents who were very proud of me and cared for me, and two brothers who were quite accomplished and successful. We had come a long way from that tiny one-bedroom apartment on Euclid Street. A declaration of war. Toward the end of the previous year, I began to feel that something was wrong with Andrea. She had always been there for me and the kids, but lately she seemed distracted. I was increasingly watching the kids alone on weekends, which didn't bother me because any time I had off from work, I tried to spend with my family. So when she told me she needed time to herself and wanted to go out, I asked no questions and was happy to stay with the kids to give Andrea some time to herself. I realized too late that this was part of the problem. So I hired a private investigator, and by mid-January they had a report ready. His name was Tom Jeffries. He owned a small and expensive restaurant a few miles from my house. Andrea and the kids and I used to go there regularly, but hadn't been there in months. Since Andrea made reservations most of the time and chose where we ate, I guessed why we stopped going there. I had met the asshole a few times when he acted as host and came in to check on the customers. I remember him being a very good-looking guy, smooth and charming. They also used to work out at the same gym, and apparently they work out together regularly these days. Rich bored housewife with kids who are already in school gets into a relationship with a jerk with a flexible schedule who can come and go as he pleases. We had a housekeeper who did the house and cooking, so Andrea had a lot of free time too. Since the kids were in school, Andrea had been taking classes at the local community college every now and then for the past few years. I figured she had plenty to keep her busy as it was. Obviously, she needed more distractions. They had video and audio tapes to prove everything. As I read the report, I felt numb and nauseous. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, it did. As she and her lover sat in a restaurant, not his own, two detectives sitting at a neighboring table managed to record a conversation that would play an important role in what would happen in the near and long term. Andrea wasn't just having a random meaningless affair. She was planning to leave me, take half of everything I had built, and move her lover in with her and the kids. All this time I had suspected that Andrea might be having an affair, but for some reason I had never considered that she might want to leave me for her lover. When I first realized that the report confirmed my suspicions, I still hadn't thought about the fact that this was the end of my family. I guess I took it for granted that Andrea and I were forever. Perhaps my mind was shaken at the time, and I still assumed that the family and life I loved so much would continue into the future. Although the revelation had only occurred a few minutes earlier, not only had I not yet considered leaving Andrea, but for some reason my mind still hadn't considered the possibility that Andrea would want to leave me either. I thought about the fact that it would be difficult for a while, but I would tell Andrea about her affair, and she would immediately stop seeing another man. We would find a way to continue living together as a couple and as a family. But as I read the transcript of that conversation in the restaurant, I realized that for Andrea, this wasn't just a side job that she could easily give up and come back to me with apologies and remorse. She seemed to want to be on a new team, and I was no longer part of her future plans. They discussed a lot of things in that conversation. Apparently, their private time behind closed doors was too precious and meant to be fun. Planning and scheming was meant to be done in between. This lunch seemed to be one of those breaks. Besides the fact that Andrea was going to leave me and take the kids, she and her lover were planning to get me to either sell the company so that she would get her share of its value or have me take out a loan to buy it back. Andrea assured the asshole that there was no way I wanted to lose the company, so I would just take out a loan to pay her off. He agreed that it would be the quickest and cleanest way anyway. Bastard reminded her not to forget about half of our personal assets, alimony, and child support. It seems Tom Jeffries had found his retirement plan, and Andrea was it. I was just a sucker who was going to fund their future, but found myself excluded from the party itself. The conversation moved into an area that I had to reread several times to fully understand what they were talking about. Basically, the gist of this part of their conversation was that the divorce attorney Tom had found would convince the judge in the initial divorce filing that I was very likely to move company assets overseas, so all company accounts should be frozen. This involved a lot of risk for me because Double O was doing international business, and the company had international checking accounts that held funds in local currencies that received income from sales overseas and made payments to overseas vendors and suppliers in their own currencies. It was more profitable to keep the funds in the local currency rather than pay double the price of converting to US dollars and then back to the local currency. Finding out this information was a gold mine. I still had time to stop this action. Before I even finished the report, I called and set up an appointment with Sam Darling, my business attorney. He immediately set up an appointment for me. I thanked the private investigator, told them to stay on top of the case, and make every effort to relay as much of their conversation to me as possible. The private investigators told me that they could not listen in on their private conversations, especially those between my wife and her attorneys. They wouldn't risk their license for me. They were able to record this conversation because it took place in a public place, and it could be argued that anyone in the vicinity could have overheard it. However, the lead private investigator told me that I could always put a bug on my wife's phone and listen to conversations on my own without their involvement. He told me what app to use and how to do it. I thanked them and left the office to make an appointment with an attorney. Andrea wasn't just cheating and planning to leave me. She was planning to declare war on me. She planned to destroy and take away everything I had built and everything I held dear. First things first. I had long ago learned to break down what needed to be done into smaller, more manageable pieces and deal with the most important and urgent first. And the most important thing was to stop freezing the company's assets. The goons didn't realize that if they succeeded in getting a judge to approve the freezing of the company's accounts, there would be nothing left to divide the business. Double O would be out of business. I had suppliers, vendors, employees, and other bills to pay. Over 90% of the revenue went to pay expenses. The company needed a steady cash flow to stay afloat. This is what you get when a bored housewife with no business experience and an idiot who clearly spent more time in the kitchen than in the boardroom join forces. I hoped that at least their, yes, at this point I was thinking of them, not her, lawyer, wasn't that stupid. I rushed to Sam's law office, and apparently he had given instructions to the receptionist, because she immediately ushered me into his office. I briefly told him everything I had learned during the morning. He looked up from his notes and interrupted me. I'm going to go see if Bob or George are busy. They're both divorce attorneys, and I think we need one of them in this conversation. With those words, he left and returned with George. After a brief introduction, George sat down and Sam relayed the information to him, and I corrected or added some things. As Sam continued to relay the information to George, I mentally went over every possible scenario for my marriage and my company. After coming to some sort of decision, I cut Sam off halfway through. Whatever, let them do it. Both turned to me with a surprised look on their faces, and Sam asked me, let them do what? Whatever they want to do. Let them do it. With those words, I stood up and shook their hands. Since both were still perplexed about what had just happened, I told them, sorry guys for taking up your time. I have a couple very important calls to make. Sam, I'll send you a check for a few $100,000 as an advance, just in case I need them. Hopefully I won't need it, but I want the company to have the money just in case. Sam, I'll keep in touch with you. George, it's nice to meet you, but I don't think I need you yet. If anything changes, I'll be in touch. Being a fan of military history, I thought about the military moving supplies to multiple locations in case the main supply depot was threatened. The $300,000 I ended up sending to Sam as a down payment was in case Andrea did declare war and I needed to defend myself. With those words, I left their office and returned to my own. The first phone call I made was to Alec Panis. Taking risks and playing the ostrich. For most of my life, I have been a risk taker, and for the most part, I have believed in the goodness of people. I had two people's goodness to test, and I was going to take some serious risks. One, I was going to take the risk that, given all of our history and all that we meant to each other, my wife would soon come to her senses and come back to me. Two, I was going to throw a bone to Alex Panis. The best thing that could be said about Alex was that he was a prankster. Although he had no formal education, he was extremely intelligent. He had the same background as me. He was from an immigrant family and had dropped out of school early to help them. Now he was, among other things, in the business of bringing rich people up to speed. A couple years ago, I was introduced to him at a party by John Dalton, a very wealthy retired businessman. John had a high opinion of Alex and introduced me with the same pride that a father introduces his favorite child. John mentioned that he thought Alex would accomplish a lot, and that he was a man who gets things done for people like John and me. But he assured me that Alex is more than that, and that one day he will be more successful than he is. High praise from someone like John, but at the time I didn't understand how Alex could be used, even though I liked him immediately. He was friendly, witty, and very charismatic. I remember thinking at the time that not only could Alex sell ice to the Eskimos, but he could probably convince them to make it for him first. Last year, I ran into Alex again at an industry convention in Vegas. He had a booth with himself and a few hot models. I guess like everyone else, the beautiful women in tight, revealing dresses caught my eye, and I went to see what they were all about. I learned that he was an independent contractor working with my competitor to bring large clients to him for commissions. A few months after the convention, in October, Alex contacted me with an offer to do for Double O what he was doing for my competitor. He told me that the competitor he was working with owed him over $1 million in commissions, and they were trying to underprice their agreement. Apparently, Alex was much more successful than they had anticipated, and they were trying to renegotiate their agreement after the fact. This was very short-sighted of them, knowing how successful Alex had been in attracting large buyers for them. At the convention, he invited me to a party he was throwing in one of the hotel suites. There were several beautiful women mingling with a few invited guests. The guests were all men in my industry. He introduced me to one of the girls and then left. Now, knowing what my wife was doing, I regret not trying to seduce her, if, indeed, seduction was even necessary. Instead, after talking to her for about 10 minutes, I decided to socialize with the other guests and ended up leaving rather early. I hadn't accepted Alex's proposal last October. During our time together, I felt like I got to know him pretty well, and there were things to admire and like about him. However, there were also things that bothered me. It was obvious that he was very intelligent, thought outside the box, had the energy of a 10-man, and was an extremely talented salesman. On the other hand, I was a little concerned about how he was able to acquire clients. I didn't know anything for sure, but I felt a little uneasy about bringing my company to him and having it all turn against me in the end. I called Alex and he agreed to come over at 10 in the morning the next day. The next person I called was John Dalton. John was in his 70s. He was a very successful businessman that I was fortunate enough to be friends with, and he had more money than God. He was also a man who seemed to really sympathize with Alex and became a mentor of sorts to him. I had a lot to discuss with John, too. A little after 7 in the evening, I walked into my house with the full intention of playing ostrich. The only chance we had was for my wife to realize her mistake and willingly come back to me. Andrea acknowledged my coming home, but it was a hurried acknowledgement from the kitchen that dinner would be ready in a few minutes. Now that I knew what to look for, I realized that physically she was there for me, but at least when it came to me, she was just doing her chores. I wondered if there was still hope for us, or was I just a naive optimist? Playing the violin while the double O burns. Well, bet number 1 didn't materialize. On Wednesday, February 13th, I was served at the office. The timing was interesting. For the past month, I've been trying to get my wife back, but have only gotten a lukewarm response from her at best. I guess she found the idea of spending another Valentine's Day with me repugnant. She must have had conflicting plans for dinner the next night. Obviously, she canceled her date with me. I went through the paperwork and verified that the packet included a judge's order freezing all of Double O's accounts. The order stated that there would be a hearing before a judge in 30 days, at which time the freeze could be lifted and other matters discussed. In addition, I was to provide the other side with a long list of financial documents they requested. Interestingly, they did not impose any freezes on any of our personal accounts. I guess since Andrea had access to all those accounts, they didn't see fit to do that. Well, now I knew two things for sure. One, I'd really lost my wife. And second, that they had hired an incompetent divorce attorney with more chutzpah than business knowledge. The fire had been lit, and it was time to watch Double O burn. I called a meeting with the general counsel, COO, and CFO. Until now, they were unaware of my marital problems or the financial action my wife and her lover were planning to take against me. It was time to bring them up to speed. I explained everything to my top managers. John, the attorney, asked to see the documents. My CFO stated that we couldn't survive 30 days without access to the accounts. That no one would give us a loan under these circumstances. That we had already mailed out payroll checks and authorized electronic payments to those employees who wanted to receive their paychecks that way. The funds would be withdrawn from Double O's checking account the next day and received by employees on the 15th. We also made payments to vendors that will eventually be canceled, and that we have many more payments to make to vendors and suppliers over the next 30 days. My COO said that maybe we can explain the situation to the employees, and they will agree to an IOU until we get out of this mess. We need to explain the situation to the vendors and hope they continue to supply us in the interim. My general counsel added that we need to try to get an emergency court hearing so that the judge will grant a stay on the injunction to freeze Double O's accounts. I listened to all three of them and told them that I needed to think about what to do. I told the CFO that I would try to find funds to pay the outstanding checks, but I may have to lay off employees temporarily until hopefully this mess is sorted out. I asked my attorney how long he thought the emergency hearing would take. That seemed to discourage him a bit, but he said it would probably take at least a couple weeks, if not more. Then I said it was almost the same as an automatic hearing, to which he agreed. I pointed out that it is important that the hearing be held before the same judge who made the original decision, and he may not be the one we were assigned for the emergency hearing if he is not available. That could cause confusion and further delay the case. He agreed that that was a possibility. Then I turned to the COO and told him that we might have to wind down until this mess was behind us, but give me time to think it over, and I would let him know. The COO told me that if we can't supply our customers, they will go to our competitors. We have to maintain supplies somehow. I told him I was aware of this. Then, to their surprise, I abruptly called an end to the meeting and said we would reconvene the next morning. It was all in vain. I had already decided that I would let the Double O burn if my wife lit a match. However, I needed to pretend that I was trying to save a company I had no intention of saving. I didn't go home that night. I just sent Andrea a text saying I wasn't coming home, asking her to take care of the kids, and letting her know that I was very busy and wouldn't be able to see them for a week or two. She only replied with an okay. We both knew what was going on. There was nothing else that could be said. The kids meant the world to me, and I knew Andrea would take good care of them. That was something I wasn't worried about. I had a fire to throw an accelerant on, and at the same time it felt like I was putting it out. Over the next month or two, I was going to be a very busy arsonist and playing firefighter at the same time. Being busy and focused helped me suppress the deep, dark emotions wanting to come out. Feelings of betrayal, deep sadness, anger, and loss. There would be time for that later. Over the next 20 days, we laid off employees, contacted our vendors and customers to let them know the situation and that we intended to stay in business and be patient. Many told us they would try their best, but they needed the goods delivered. We were just one cog in the chain, and if we didn't deliver our goods, their own workers would sit idle. They would not be able to deliver goods to their customers and meet their deadlines. My wife, her lover, and the imbecile they hired have left many companies flailing around trying to deal with the mess they created. Three people who have never produced anything of real value in their lives have left the manufacturers and builders in our society flailing around to put out the fires they have started. While I wanted to seem like I was also one of those trying to put out the fire, I was actually doing my best to make sure everything burned in a timely manner. Double O had grown rapidly over the past 10 years, and while I generously set aside money in our personal accounts for my wife to spend on the house, the kids, and herself, and to give to her parents, I reinvested most of the profits back into the business. That way, most of the money stayed in the company. This probably played a big part in my wife and her team deciding to seize the assets of the company. Interestingly, my wife only withdrew about $50,000 from our savings account at Chase and left the rest of the money untouched in the checking and savings accounts. She also didn't touch anything in the mutual funds. Apparently, her attorney didn't want it to look like she was acting in bad faith. There was almost $2 million in all the accounts. I withdrew all but $100,000 and used those funds to pay employees, pay health insurance premiums, and the rest of the company's obligations as I could. A businessman always has access to lines of credit that he may need. I had a personal line of credit with a bank for $1 million and another $750,000 secured by a house. I requested those funds and used them to pay the rest of my bills as much as I could. After all, a conscientious businessman always pays his debts. I knew that a partial payment would not help them make future loans to us. They all made it clear that they had to pay first before they could supply us with goods in the future. I didn't throw money into the fire hoping to put it out. I guess I didn't play the violin while the double O was burning. I was throwing everything of value we owned into the fire so that everything would burn with it. Although I had no intention of saving double O, I needed witnesses to confirm that I had done everything I could to keep the company afloat. 22 days after I was served with the divorce papers, I decided it was time to hire a divorce attorney. After all, I was too busy trying to save my company. I scoured the yellow pages and went through the list of divorce attorneys, checking each name on the American Bar Association website to see how old each one was and what law school they had graduated from. When I found one who had graduated just 2 years ago and attended a small local law school that had barely received accreditation, I knew I had found my man. He only had one task to accomplish, and I hoped he wouldn't screw it up. But even if he did, it would still serve my purpose. I called him and told him that I had been served with divorce papers 3 weeks ago. The hearing is scheduled in a little over a week, but I'm not ready for it. I need him to get a continuance and for me to meet with him in a week or two when I have some free time to discuss the divorce with him. I told him I would send him a copy of the divorce papers immediately along with a $5,000 prepayment by messenger. He thanked me for my business, and we parted ways, scheduling a meeting in 10 days. I had not the slightest intention of honoring that deadline. A few rather important details that have been left out for now. The first thing Andrea and I did was sign a prenuptial agreement before the wedding. Unfortunately, it didn't specify how much she would receive in the event of a divorce. When we got married, I didn't care about that. I was concerned about the issue of control. Although I was very optimistic that I would one day be very successful, I wanted to share that with my wife, even if the marriage turned out to be a failure. More importantly, I wanted to enter into the marriage in good faith. It seemed to me that a prenuptial agreement to divide assets in the event of divorce would cast dark clouds over our marriage. Although I had founded Double O before I met Andrea, most of its present value was obtained in the years after we were married. Thus, she would have had legal rights to increase the value of the company from our wedding day until today. In California, where community property exists, she would have been entitled to half of that increase. In entering into the prenuptial agreement, I was concerned about having complete discretion and running the company as I saw fit. Therefore, in the prenuptial agreement, Andrea gave me full discretion to run the company without any interference from her. The second part, excluded at this point, is my negotiations with Alex Panis and John Dalton. At a meeting with Alex in January, we discussed bringing him into the company. I worked out a payment plan for him based on production volume. This would allow him to receive a higher percentage than the commissions he was receiving from my competitor. Even more generous when you consider that the other company he was referring clients for was delaying the full payout. In addition, he received a generous residual payment for the referred business over the life of the contract. The commission structure he was currently utilizing provided a percentage of the business for the first calendar year only. When I first introduced Alex, I explained that Alex was my second major risk, the first being that my wife would come back to me and not go through with the divorce. So far, the agreement I had made with Alex was not a significant risk. The risk was the side agreement I had made with Alex and whether I could fully trust Alex. For one thing, Alex was a serial cheater. He had been married for several years, and I was sure he had been having fun with several of his models and probably a few more girls. He was handsome enough, but not the most handsome guy in the world. But he was extremely charismatic, had the gift of gab, and women were drawn to him. It seemed to me that he came from a culture where men thought you had a wife who was the mother of your children, and you had mistresses on the side. On the other hand, everyone I talked to, and everyone who did business with him that we talked to, and I vetted him thoroughly when we discussed him coming on board back in October, told me that he was a man of his word. You could do business with him on the basis of a handshake and fully expect him to hold up his end of the bargain. Actually, that was part of his problem with my competitor, who wasn't paying him. Alex assumed that the owner of the company was a person just like him, and their agreement was sealed with a handshake. They did not have a formal written and signed contract that spelled out all the details. So while the above agreement was a formal contract signed by both of us, I made a second agreement with Alex that was only finalized with a handshake. I explained to him what my wife and her lover were planning. It was interesting to watch him bemoan the fact that my wife was cheating on me while he was such a womanizer himself. I wondered if he was in denial about what he was doing, or if he had one standard for wives and another for husbands. In the end, the second agreement was that if my wife lit a match, I would let her burn the double O to the ground. When it appears to me that all is lost and it is impossible to save the company, I will sell it and the remaining assets to him. John Dalton has already agreed to financially support the purchase of my company and would provide liquidity for the new venture by injecting the necessary funds into it. I would be paid $2 million for Double O, which was about 4% of the company's value that we had recently appraised. Double O's executives could honestly attest that I had done everything I could to save the company. But there was no hope, as the factory was idle, our suppliers were unwilling to send us new products, and we had lost too many customers to competitors. Alex and John were paying me the liquidation value for the company. Under the terms of the agreement, the funds in Double O's accounts were to go to compensate employees for the time they were laid off, suppliers, and other debtors. Creditors had a right of first refusal on the company's assets anyway, and I, as a shareholder, was one of the last in line. Although the company had not formally filed for bankruptcy, disagreeing with the terms that John and Alex had set, which were really my terms, would have driven the company into bankruptcy. In addition, I was to continue working for the new company for 6 months to help Alex transition to the new majority owner and CEO, without pay. This was part of the $2 million I received. The part where I had to trust Alex and John was that I would be the secret owner of 50% of the company, with 30% going to Alex and the remaining 20% to John. But on paper, Alex would own 80% and John would get the remaining 20%. And that's exactly what we did. Exactly 47 days after we were served with the divorce papers, Double O ceased to exist. Alex was of Greek descent, and we named the new company Odysseus Enterprises. We thought it was fitting because of Odysseus's intelligence, adventurousness, and penchant for risk. It turned out, quite by accident, that Odysseus was the one who invented the Trojan horse. Jerk. Another tidbit I missed was the asshole. The asshole had seen my kids and Andrea and me. We were all regulars at his restaurant. Not only did he know that Andrea was married, but that she had two small children. He wasn't some coworker who worked with Andrea 40 hours a week, and somewhere in there they bonded and fell in love with each other. He met Andrea's husband, me, and children, and still decided to seduce her and separate my children's parents. If he hadn't specifically intended to create this opportunity, it's unlikely he would have confronted her at the gym. He intended to seduce her. Regardless of how Andrea and I ended up meeting, I had decided back in January that the asshole would pay for his intrusion. So, after solidifying an unwritten agreement with Alex and John in January, I went to Sean Hicks. Sean was an independent external marketer whose services I've used for the past 7 years. He mainly handled our website development, search engine optimization, and social media marketing, mostly for branding. Sean ran a 3-person store, and at this point, I directed most of my business to him. Although we didn't become friends, we had become friends over the past few years as he had worked on several online campaigns for us. I was now using a larger advertising agency, but continued to work with Sean out of loyalty. He always talked about how much he appreciated the business I was helping him with. It was up to me to test how deep Sean's appreciation ran. Sean and I met the 3rd week of January in my office. Getting right to the point, I told him we had a confidential matter to discuss. But before we could discuss it, I wanted him to sign a non-disclosure agreement that my attorney had prepared. Sean looked over the NDA, readily signed and dated it. Sean, you are very good at building brands, gaining positive recognition for the company, and helping it grow. How good are you at doing it in reverse, using social media to destroy a company? Sean thought for a minute and replied, I think it's the same concept, and it's probably easier to use negativity. Marketing targets are probably more willing to believe that than the positive marketing statements they are constantly bombarded with. But it also depends on how big the company is, how many resources it has to fend you off, and whether you're trying to negatively influence it nationwide or in a small neighborhood. Well, it's a local restaurant. Sean started laughing and leaned back in his chair. A restaurant? That would be the easiest thing to do. I've had several restaurants as clients. This is the easiest business to screw up. A cockroach here, a mouse there, negative reviews. I was thinking the same thing. There was a Peruvian restaurant I liked to go to regularly for lunch. One day I discovered a hair in my food. The manager tried to compensate me for it, but I had had enough. I never went back again. I know this can happen anywhere, and I've never had a problem with them before. But the association of dirty food with the food just discouraged me from going there again. It was literally a gut reaction, not an intellectual one. Sean nodded. Exactly. Restaurants take a long time to gain credibility, and they can lose it overnight. Not that I think it can happen overnight, Daniel. It takes time. A few weeks, if not months. At least that's what I'm thinking right now. It's okay, Sean. There's no need to rush it. Honestly, if you can make it so that the restaurant slowly loses business and he keeps putting more and more money out of his pocket to try to keep it going, it'll be even better. I want him to drain all his savings and everything he has before he has to close the business. I gave Sean the name of the business. I explained to him what the owner was trying to do to me and my family. He understood and seemed to sympathize with my situation. Sean and I met about a week later, and he already had a strategy in place to take down the restaurant. Sean began like this. The first thing I needed to do was to start almost a dozen fake social media accounts. There are services that sell you friends or contacts for each of the various services. They are relatively cheap, but they make you look like a legitimate user with lots of contacts and friends. This will make our fake accounts attractive to other people living and doing business in the area, who we will want to befriend and who themselves have lots of friends and contacts on social media. The next thing I've already started doing and will continue to do is to reach out to legitimate influencers in the area, or just people who are using their social media accounts to try and draw attention to themselves and/or their business. It could be an attorney, an accountant, a bored housewife, an attention-seeking teenager, whatever. Many of these people have hundreds, if not thousands, of contacts. I approach them from fake social accounts and try to befriend them. They almost always agree because they see how many friends I have and think they can expand their social circle with my contacts. People with hundreds or thousands of friends usually don't even know most of them and accept friendship requests from all of them. Then we go to the friends of people on their contact lists and send friendship requests to them as well. We spread this out over time, targeting only a few requests a day from each contact source so that we don't attract unnecessary attention from either the social media companies or our new friends or potential friends. Next, of course, when people see that I have a new contact with thousands of friends, they will try to friend me as well. This will take anywhere from a few weeks to maybe a couple months or so for our purposes. In the meantime, I will send them local information about this or that business. I'll post some interesting facts about local businesses. Not too much so that they don't get pissed off about having too much information dumped on them, but so that we can back up when we start sending negative information about the restaurant. I've also started several blogs where I discuss and do reviews of local businesses. Eventually, an article or two will appear there with a restaurant review. That, and spreading rumors about a friend of a friend of a friend finding a cockroach in a particular dish, along with negative reviews spreading all over social media, should do the trick. Like you said, people are very picky about food, especially at higher-end restaurants. They will turn away from a restaurant much faster than any other type of business. My mind was already spinning 1,000 thoughts a minute as I thought of all the possible options. Sean, that's great. Just one thing. Make sure that if you're paying for something, use a gift credit card. You can get gift cards at the mall where you can put any name you want on them and they'll put it on the card, and you can use that name when you pay for something online. Use Mest Inc. Mest is the pronunciation of the word revenge in Russian. Make sure you always buy these credit cards with cash. If you've already paid for a blog or anything with credit cards, start a new blog with new credit cards. This guy is a shitty chef who now owns a small restaurant. He's not the FBI, but let's take basic precautions to cover our asses. I don't want to give him cause for a lawsuit. It's one thing if he knows I'm probably behind this. It's another if we provide him with evidence he can prove in court. Sean nodded that he understood. After Double O's accounts were frozen, Sam Darling continued to pay Sean for his services out of the fee I sent him. Bastard went after my family and my business. I didn't own Andrea, but I owned Double O's. I was going to make sure he lost his business and with it, hopefully, all of his savings. If Andrea and I had any chance of a future together, she had to come back to me willingly and choose me and us over the asshole. I wasn't trying to DU the asshole to try to change Andrea's mind. She needed to change her mind if the asshole was still an attractive option for her. I needed her to choose me, not come back to me by default or coercion. Confrontation. It had been 47 days since I filed for divorce, but Double O was sold. I was technically unemployed if working meant earning an income. Now there were other aspects of my divorce to deal with. One of the $2 million I received as payment for the Double O would go toward paying off the $1 million personal line of credit I had obtained. Thus, Andrea and I were left with a little over $1 million to split. My negligent divorce attorney had served his time, got a continuance, and was too green and incompetent to realize the need for a scheduled hearing to lift the asset freeze. It was time for a change of counsel. It was time to hire the best divorce attorney. It was finally time to counterattack. It was time to call George. Since the filing, I'd seen the kids on weekends, Andrea dropping them off at my parents' house where I'd pick them up. I rented a 2-bedroom apartment through Airbnb. It was the quickest temporary solution until I could find my own place. I didn't communicate with Andrea directly, and she didn't get in touch either. It seems that after 12 years of dating and 10 years of marriage, we had to communicate through intermediaries and strangers, our attorneys. George and her attorney set up a meeting in early April. As we entered Andrea's law office, I noticed Tom Jeffries sitting in the reception area looking through a magazine. He was trying to look disinterested and inconspicuous, trying to casually cast a glance at the magazine in our direction. His eyes and I met, and I stared at him intently without averting my gaze. We stared at each other for about 10 seconds before he looked away. I smiled inwardly, thinking, "That's it, bitch. You're a little boy trying to play a man's game." George, who hadn't moved while I scrutinized the bitch, chuckled slightly when Tom looked away. He rubbed my shoulder and said, "Let's get this over with." I hadn't seen my wife in almost 2 months. She looked well, but tired. Perhaps life hadn't been a solid rose for her either since the last time we saw each other. Maybe she felt guilty about what she was doing to me, to our family. Maybe she wasn't as sure of the right path to take as I'd heard on that tape a couple months ago. More likely, I was just making a lot of assumptions that weren't there because I still wanted to believe in her goodness. She put the kids at my complete disposal when I wanted to see them, but she and I did not communicate directly. Her attorney introduced himself as Jack Davis. He and George then shook hands. When he extended his hand to shake mine, I laughed and told him, "It's okay." I figured I don't shake hands with incompetent imbeciles, but he was about to find out soon enough. There's no reason to start a conversation with name-calling. However, there was nothing wrong with setting the right tone for the meeting from the start. This was a hostile meeting, and I wasn't going to play nice. I figured I could afford it since all the cards were in my hands. After George and I took our seats across from Jack and Andrea, I stared intently and directly at Andrea without averting my gaze. She stared back for a few seconds at first until she fidgeted in her chair, found something interesting on the conference table, and shifted her gaze there. Jack started with how he thought the meeting should go, and then asked George, "I realize that all the financial documents have to be crammed into several boxes, so I didn't expect you to carry them here. When do you expect to deliver them?" George smiled back, pulled a relatively thin folder out of his briefcase, and placed it in front of Jack with the words, "Actually, we brought everything. Here are the financial reports." I didn't take my eyes off Andrea. I had a very serious and stoic expression on my face as I stared at her intently. She looked up for a moment to watch George and Jack's interaction, and then glanced at the meager file folder. After briefly meeting my eyes, she stared at the same spot on the conference table again. She seemed nervous, her hands moving frantically. My behavior, or perhaps my very presence, was clearly making her uncomfortable. Jack paged through the papers for a few minutes, blushing, and finally asked angrily, "What the hell is this?" I thought Mr. Nice and Gracious went out the window very quickly. This brought a smile to my face. Little joys like that sometimes make life worth living. Jack must have noticed because he gave me a nasty look for a moment, making my smile even wider. Clearly unhappy with what he'd seen, he went back to looking at George. It looked like Jack and I didn't have a friendship in our future. George replied, "That's all. We can provide other documents if you specify what you need, but I thought we should start with what I just handed you." In the end, my client was forced to sell Octavian Eagles Inc. for $2 million. Andrea suddenly looked up and stared at me incredulously as soon as George said the word sell. I stared at her again, imagining my eyes drilling into her soul. The $1 million was used to pay off a personal loan my client had to take out to try and save the company because you assholes froze all the funds and had a fire sale of the company. So the $1 million will be split between our clients in the divorce. Excuse me, guys. I'm going to step in. George, you forgot about the $750,000 line of credit I had to take out on the house, which also went to pay off business expenses. There was already a $1.2 million loan taken out on the house. So this was in addition to that. Now it doesn't have to be paid back right away. It's a 5-year loan, so we have time to pay it off, honey. Honey sounded 80% sarcasm and 20% venom. Or maybe I got the percentages mixed up. I had to withdraw almost everything from our checking and savings accounts and mutual funds to try to keep the company afloat, since I didn't have the funds to run the business. So I'm afraid they're gone too, dear. I finished my statement, staring directly at Andrea again. But this time she was staring back again with a perplexed and shocked expression on her face. Andrea chose this moment to speak for the first time and somewhat hesitantly asked, What are you trying to do, Daniel? Well, honey, what do you think is going to happen when you freeze all of Double O's accounts? How was I going to pay all the suppliers, all the employees, all the bills? You might be surprised to learn that employees don't want to work for you when their checks don't clear, and you tell them you don't know if or when you'll be able to pay them. The same goes for suppliers. And customers aren't so understanding when you tell them you're sorry, but your lovely wife is having fun with another man, and she doesn't need you anymore, so she's frozen all company assets. That you don't know when you can ship them the goods they ordered, the merchandise they need to deliver on time so they can satisfy their customers. That moron in the lobby doesn't seem to be thinking straight, but I thought you had more sense than to freeze Andrea's Double O accounts. And I thought this imbecile knew better. I uttered the last phrase, looking at Jack with disgust. When I brought up the moron sitting in the hall, Andrea reflexively looked in the direction where the hall should have been, and then looked at me again with a questioning expression on her face. Yeah, I know you were entertaining the retard sitting outside, honey. So, this is where we are, Andrea. We need to split the million. The mutual funds and all the other accounts are empty. I had to use them to try to save Double O, and now I'm without income. So you guys are going to have to rethink your demands a little bit. Well, actually a lot more than a little. Andrea looked completely shocked. Jack was telling George how it wouldn't go away, and some other nonsense that I wasn't paying much attention to. I was busy looking at Andrea, who looked like a little lost girl with no friend in the world. I had saved her once before, but now she no longer belonged to me. Now it was up to the jerk to save her. I was sick of looking at Andrea, and I felt like I needed to get out of there as soon as possible. So I stood up and told them that if there was nothing else, we were leaving now. I turned around and started to walk away, and George smiled nonchalantly and said, "Well, I guess we're done. Call us when you're ready to talk again." I walked toward the lobby, looking intently at the asshole again. He looked away again, and we left. That night I sat in my empty living room with a glass in my hand. Andrea texted me, "Is it true? Did you really lose the OO?" I replied with a simple, "Yes." About 10 minutes later, she replied, "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to lose OO. I know she meant everything to you." Andrea had hope after all. Maybe she didn't turn out to be the cold, evil bitch I was beginning to think she was. I didn't want the woman I loved and trusted for over 10 years of my life to turn out to be an evil bitch who wanted to destroy the company I'd built from the ground up. I still wanted to have faith in the mother of my children. It was then that I realized that in the last few months I had completely let go of my emotions. I am very good at compartmentalizing people. I stoically focused on what would help me achieve my goals. First, I tried to save my marriage, and then I tried to save my company by first destroying it. I didn't let emotions that would be counterproductive to achieving my goals get in my way. Now, the slightest gesture of goodwill from the woman I had loved for so long, and with whom I had shared the most intimate moments of my life, my soon-to-be ex-wife, reached me, and I sat sobbing in the middle of the living room of my dimly lit temporary rental apartment. There were no winners in this divorce, only losers. If I could trust Alex and John, and I truly believed I could, then I kept my company and control of it, which was more important to me than holding on to full value. But I lost my family. I lost my wife, whom, as I admitted to myself more than I had in the last few months, I loved completely. And probably still do. Though I no longer allowed myself to even think about it. I lost the ability to see my kids every night. I would most likely see them every weekend. We would spend all day trying to catch up, and only when we relaxed and had normal interactions with each other did I have to take them back to my mother's house. There were no winners in this mess. Why, Andrea? Why the hell did you do this to me? To us? And that's what I did. I sent Andrea a text message with one word. Why? The whole time I stuck to my plan of not showing the other side any weakness. No emotion. But now I did it impulsively. I didn't get an answer. I wasn't expecting one. She really couldn't say anything magical to explain it all. Cross the T's and dot the I's. The lawyers went back and forth. Jack wanted one document or another. He questioned my CFO and several executives who worked at Double O and now work at Odysseus Enterprises. In the end, I think they were satisfied that the company had indeed been sold for $2 million. Jack called another meeting for Andrea and me to sign the agreement that he and George had negotiated. We found ourselves in the same conference room again, but this time the asshole was nowhere to be seen. Jack went over the list of the divorce agreement he and George had worked out. We were splitting a little over $500,000 between us and $3,000 a month in alimony. Andrea would get primary custody of the kids, which we both wanted since I had my own business, and I would pick the kids up once a week and once on the weekends. After finishing going through the list, Jack looked up at me and said, "Against my advice, Mrs. Orloff agrees not to receive child support, and Mrs. Orloff agrees to put the house up for sale and split the proceeds equally." With the financial matters settled and the agreement signed, I got up to leave. There was something else I needed to discuss with Andrea alone, but I decided to do it over the weekend when I picked up the kids. Before I was about to leave, however, Andrea spoke up and asked if she could talk to me privately. We had exchanged a few words when I picked up or dropped off the kids, but that was about it. I wondered what she wanted to talk about. Jack suggested a conference room where we could talk, and he and George took the papers and left. We were both hesitant to say anything, but she had asked for the meeting, and I waited for her to start. "Daniel, once again, I want to say that I'm very sorry you lost Double O. I know how much the company meant to you, and the last thing I wanted was for you to lose the company. I got some really bad advice." And that was where she stopped. She was visibly starting to get agitated, but she tried to keep her cool. I wasn't the only one who could contain my emotions and keep a stoic expression on my face. Gathering her strength, she continued. "Anyway, I've enrolled in nursing school. I have enough credits from the last few years, and I can get my nursing license in 2 years." That was unexpected. I nodded at her and said, "Good for you, Andrea. I'm sure you'll do great." It was amazing how we had gone from two close people who could talk about anything to barely communicating awkward, hesitant acquaintances. "I have a favor to ask of you, Daniel, and please feel free to decline if you don't want to. Right now, you and the kids have one weekday after school and every weekend. When my classes start, and I know my schedule better, would you mind taking the kids more often?" "Sure, whenever you can." I wondered what this was all about. She had a mom she could ask, but I wasn't about to look a gift horse in the mouth. I readily agreed, excited to be able to spend extra time with my kids. "Andrea, just a couple more things. I was going to tell you about it later, but don't worry about selling the house right now. I'll be making the payments." "Daniel, that's very generous of you, but it's almost summer. I need to find a new place to live before the next school year starts for the kids. I need to know what school to enroll them in. First of all, I want the kids to stay at the private school they go to. It's the best school in the neighborhood, and they've already made a lot of friends there. Their education is very important to me. I will find a way to pay for it, and in the meantime, I have $500,000 that I can use until I get a job. Let me worry about that. Same thing with the house. The kids are having a hard enough time as it is, and I want them to have as much stability as possible. So at least until the end of their next school year, I'll cover the payments. If we need to sell the house, we'll figure it out next summer." Andrea asked me what was wrong. I wanted to tell her that the jerk couldn't move out and she couldn't bring him to my kids, but I decided it was best not to bring it up. We were getting a divorce. I can't tell her who she can and can't date. Obviously, if she continues to date this jerk, she will bring him to us. We had already started socializing with each other, and she obviously not only put no barriers between me and the kids, but encouraged even more socializing. For the sake of the kids, we needed to be able to socialize, not at each other's throats. As much as the thought of having a jerk around my kids bothered me, I decided to leave it at that. There was little chance they wouldn't last long. By the time the last divorce hearing was held in October, I learned from the kids that the asshole had shown up a couple times, but hadn't been around for the past couple months. I couldn't help but wonder if there was trouble in paradise. There were so many little sad moments that triggered emotions in me. The transfer of ownership of her car, disconnecting her from my health insurance, I left the kids on mine. All of these little final events that drove one nail into the coffin of our now dead marriage, one at a time. The day Andrea transferred her cell phone, I got a call from her new number, and all I heard was a quiet whine on the other end until she hung up. It was obvious that these nails in the coffin had affected her as well. The final nail was a hearing in October to finalize the divorce. The hearing turned out to be a mere formality. As we were leaving the courtroom, I asked Andrea if she wanted to get coffee. She responded by asking if I could stop by her house one of the following evenings so we could talk. I told her sure, and we made a date for Friday night. She said her mom would watch the kids. Long-awaited conversation. I went to my old house, knocked on the door again as any out-of-towner would do, and Andrea welcomed me. She had a glass of Cabernet and asked if I wanted a drink. I thanked her, agreed, and she poured me a glass. As it seems now, in the distant past, we usually spent most of our time in the family room. But now we were sitting in the living room reserved for guests. We sat across from each other and sipped our wine. Finally, Andrea asked what I wanted to talk about when I suggested we meet for coffee. I smiled and said it wouldn't take long. I just wanted to tell her that I would continue to pay for the house and that I would be transferring more than the agreed-upon amount to child support. She had a sad look on her face and just nodded. We both fell silent, watching each other and playing with the wine glasses in our hands. I was starting to think it was time for me to leave when Andrea finally gathered her courage and said quietly, "You asked why." I hadn't expected it, but some part of me still wanted an answer even now. A bunch of different reasons had been running through my head since this whole thing started. I wasn't pleasing her. I wasn't enough for her. Why was she unhappy with me, with us, with our marriage, with our life? Or was it simply that Tom was a better man, a better lover, more exciting? But all of that was just speculation. Now I was going to get an answer, and I wanted to know. So I nodded in response to her question. It really came down to timing, Daniel. Just time. I think I was more confused than ever. What do you mean by time? That it's time for the marriage to end? That the marriage is exhausted? She shook her head and smiled, but it was a sad smile. She looked at the wine glass in her hand and then seemed to regain her courage. No, Daniel, it's your time. I waited a minute for her to continue, and when she didn't, I told her. Andrea, every second I wasn't working was spent with you and the kids. When we were really busy at work, I would drive home 15 minutes each way just to have dinner with the kids and see them for an hour before going to bed, and then go back to the office to finish whatever needed to be done. I was usually home by 7 o'clock in the evening. Most weekends I didn't work, and on Sundays almost never. I spent every minute and all the energy I didn't spend at work on you and the kids. No, Daniel, you spend all your time and energy away from work on the kids. Don't get me wrong, Daniel. I loved that about you. I still do. You're a wonderful father, but your husband was the problem. Yes, you used to come home to be with the kids before they went to bed. But by the time they went to bed, you were exhausted. On those weekends when you weren't working or had to attend one event or another to promote your business, you spent time with the kids. Again, Daniel, gosh, I sound so petty, like I'm jealous of the kids. Believe me, I loved and love how devoted you are to them. But I've also wanted your complete focus on them from time to time, Daniel, and I've gotten almost none of that. I suppose the reason might be that I had let Andrea down somehow, but that wasn't at all what I had envisioned. I felt like I was home a lot. Besides, I didn't seem like one of those men who sits in front of the TV with a beer in hand when I'm home. As tired as I was from work or stress, I spent a lot of energy on my family. But now I realize that almost all of that energy went to either the kids or all three of them. Andrea and I were almost never alone together. There were a lot of different compartments in my life. My company wasn't just my job. I loved her. She was my child. I cherished her and raised her to the level she was at before all of this started. She was definitely an important part of my life and took up most of my waking hours. The other part was my family. Don't get me wrong, if I had to choose between my company and my family, I would always choose family. But honestly, I would try to find every possible way to have it all before I had to make that choice. But in dividing my limited time and energy between the three areas that demanded my attention, my marriage obviously suffered. Andrea, why didn't you talk to me? Why did you just have a goddamn affair? Take the kids and leave me. Daniel, I tried several times. We'd set up dates just for the two of us here and there, and then you'd go back to your normal routine. I felt like even the few times I asked for more time with you, I was already nagging you, that I was being selfish. I wasn't looking for a goddamn affair. That was the last thing I was looking for. Tom started paying attention to me at the gym, and I thought nothing of it. He was sweet, attentive, and gave me the one commodity Daniel didn't have: time. I thought, of course he did. He has a small business that allows him to have free time in the mornings and evenings if he so desires. The restaurant didn't even open until 11, and he could probably skip lunch hours if he wanted to. But I decided to keep that little bit to myself and instead asked a question I immediately regretted. Speaking of the asshole, are you still seeing him? Andrea laughed. You mean Tom? I smiled back. Jerk, Tom, tomato, tomato, tomato. Actually, we stopped dating a couple months ago. What happened? When it started to look like there wasn't going to be a paycheck, he left? Andrea smiled. That's kind of petty, Daniel. In all these years, I've never known you to be petty. This is new ground for you. No, Daniel, I'm all done. The kids didn't like him, but in time they may have gotten over it. The reason I ended the relationship is because he tried to talk you out of it in front of the kids and alone with me. When he did that with me, I kind of realized he was jealous of you, so I usually told him to stop and just leave it at that. But I will never tolerate him doing that in front of your kids, Daniel. I will never. The first time he did that, I told him to leave and then kicked his ass the next time I saw him. When he did it again, it was over. I nodded my head. I had assumed a lot of things, but the picture I was getting now was not at all what I had envisioned. Andrea, you said he was jealous of me? What was he jealous of? He was entertaining my wife. You left me for him. And then Andrea grimaced when I brought up the fact that he was entertaining her, but smiled as she started to answer. He had everything to be jealous of, Daniel. You're everything he wanted to be. You're playing in the big leagues while he has his own little restaurant with 9 tables. It was very obvious that he was very jealous of you, and it was very easy for me to see that. It was very pathetic, very unattractive. Anyway, it's all behind me now. Andrea said the last sentence with apparent indifference, as if we were wasting time discussing something so pointless and irrelevant. I simply said, "It was." Andrea looked puzzled. Was what? I was playing in the big leagues, not anymore. Andrea gave me a mischievous grin and just nodded. I couldn't figure out what she was thinking. This conversation was shattering all the beliefs that had formed in my head over the year. That Andrea thought Tom was the better man. That Andrea was an evil person trying to destroy me and take everything from me. Then why, Andrea? Why did you lash out at Double O like that? Andrea sighed heavily, and a very sad expression appeared on her face. Daniel, it never occurred to me that what I was doing could somehow hurt Double O. I thought you'd just pay me back. I didn't expect half of it. I thought you'd either pay me back with the money you already have, or take out a loan against the company and then pay me back. Tom and then Jack kept saying that I deserved half. They told me that you'd probably remarry and have more kids, and those new kids would get all the inheritance. So even if I don't want half for myself, I have to do it to protect the kids. I didn't think I deserved half, Daniel, and I didn't expect even close to half. But you have to realize, Daniel, that I grew up poor and very insecure. I didn't work and had no income. That made me feel even more insecure. I had no education or qualifications. I just wanted security for myself and my children. They convinced me that you would try to hide assets, delay cases in court, hide financial records. Jack told me that was normal for divorces. It was a battle. I just kept thinking that with some pressure, you'd just pay me off quickly and we'd both move on with our lives. There was no way I could imagine hurting Double O. A few tears rolled down Andrea's face as she finished. I know that when you first met me, I had already discovered Double O. But you know I grew up in poverty too, Andrea. So yes, I understand the fear and anxiety you felt. Do you know that even after I found out about the two of you, I hoped you would come back to me? I tried to seduce you back into marriage. I don't know if it would have worked out, but even after the investigators confirmed you were having an affair, I still didn't realize you'd want to leave me. Did you even notice that I tried to get you back from mid-January until I was served the day before Valentine's Day? Andrea looked up a little surprised when I told her this, as if it was new information. I guess I noticed you started acting differently, but by then I didn't trust you anymore, Daniel. I'd relied on you too often to be deceived after a while. Yes, you came home earlier than usual and seemed to pay more attention to me. To be honest, I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me was afraid you knew and were just setting me up. The other part of me hoped you didn't know, but if we met again, you'd find out, and then you'd never want me. I defiled our marriage, Daniel. Don't think I don't know that and that I wasn't ashamed or that I don't feel deep shame even today. I didn't think you would want me if you found out. I had already taken the actions that set my course. I didn't think there was a way to get off this train, Daniel. It's not that you wanted to be with an asshole instead of him. You chose to be with him, Andrea. You liked him better. You were in love with him, and you're definitely not in love with me anymore. I think we were both a little surprised at the level of emotion and obvious insecurity I showed. Yes, I did like him, Daniel. I think I really liked him at one point. But I didn't divorce you to be with him. When I threw her an incredulous look, she continued. Daniel, it was actually more like the time and attention he gave me made me feel like our marriage was missing something huge. Yes, I liked him, and yes, I was drawn to him physically. He's a good-looking man, but I was like a moth to a flame from the attention and time he gave me. This man was making me the center of his world. He wanted to hear what I thought and what I had to say, not just wanted me to relay what the kids had done or said that day. That's what appealed to me the most. You know what's funny, Daniel? Breaking up with him was so easy. I made my decision, and it was final. I've never regretted that breakup or thought about it since. We both fell silent again, both clearly sad. You're right, Andrea. It all depends on timing. I accept my part of the responsibility, and I understand what you're saying, believe me. But there is another side to time, Andrea. The problem was also that you had too much free time. The kids were back in school. You had a housekeeper to cook and clean, and you had too much free time to focus on what might be missing in your life. I had different parts of my life, and I was happy as a clam. I thought we were a team. I was going on stage and making a living. A damn good living that allowed you to have so much free time to focus on what was missing in your life. Newport Beach trouble. I thought the plan was that I make a living and you take care of the house. We get together at the end of the day and become a loving, close-knit family that loves and adores each other and the kids. Andrea was crying by this point, and even though I was starting to get angry and a little defensive, I couldn't help but get upset about the whole screwed-up situation we were in. Look, Andrea, I'm really sorry. Believe me, I hear you and I realize I should have been more aware. But I think we're both right in that time has been an issue for both of us. Now that you've started school and will be paying attention to it and the kids and everything else, I think you'll understand my point of view on this. The people I see most unhappy are the people who have too much free time. A busy person doesn't have time to focus too much on their life and make themselves miserable. I couldn't help but think that the old saying that idle hands are the devil's workshop was not without meaning. After spending a few minutes trying to calm myself down, I felt I needed to assure Andrea that I had heard her. Believe me, Andrea, I see your point. I am not rejecting it. If and when I am in a relationship again, I will be very aware of it and will do everything I can to make sure it doesn't happen again. I really appreciate everything you've told me today. Still crying quietly, Andrea just nodded. We were silent for a few minutes, each in our own thoughts. Finally, I noticed Andrea move, lifted my head, and saw that she was looking right at me. With the same mischievous grin on her face, she said again, "Daniel, I know you still have the double O, whatever it's called today." I immediately tried to adopt an indignant look to refute her words. "Look, Daniel, you're taking the loss of double O way too lightly. Double O was too important to you. I guessed you had to keep it somehow, but I told my lawyer to just get the divorce finalized. Don't worry, Daniel. I'm not going to go after you or reopen the divorce. I'm glad you're keeping the company. It kills me to think that I ruined it for you. I never wanted to ruin your company, Daniel, and I never wanted to come between you and the kids. You don't have to tell me if you kept the company. I pray to God that you did. Someday, I hope to find out that you've kept it, or you'll let me know. Eventually, I hope I'll know for sure that you did. In the meantime, even if there's nothing else to do but try to reduce the guilt of this whole mess, I'd rather believe you saved it. You're too smart not to figure out a way to save and preserve it all." I smiled and nodded at her. To her, it could mean that she was right, or that I was letting her think I'd saved him. That should have been enough for now. Back to the bastard. Sean had done an excellent job in my favor. Through his fake social media accounts, he befriended hundreds of people and businesses that lived and live in South Orange County, where we lived. And more importantly, where the restaurant was located. Each of these people had hundreds and thousands of friends and contacts. Thus, Sean had access to the eyes and minds of a significant portion of the local population. First, negative reviews from various customers began appearing one after another on Yelp and Google. Then blogs began to post bad reviews of the restaurant. All of these were pinned and shared on social media and then shared again and again by friends. Then comments began to appear about cockroaches and mice believed to have been seen in the restaurant. Sean told me that these posts, which appeared on fake social media accounts he had set up, caused something we didn't expect. Other people, seeing the rumors he had spread, began sharing stories of hairs they found in their food or problems they themselves had seen at the restaurant. We wondered how much of it was true and how much was a desire to get attention or to troll the business. Either way, it served our purposes. In the end, the coup de grace came from an idea from Sam Darling. Sam came to his restaurant for lunch to tour the establishment. When his food was brought to him and his customers, one of them said it was amazing how hearty the salad dressing and food seemed, but all the calories listed on the menu were so low. That got Sam thinking, and a few days later he ordered several of their salads with dressing on the side, as well as a few of their entrees. He sent them all to the lab to be analyzed. It came back that not only were the calorie counts off the charts, but more importantly, some of the meal sauces and salad dressings had underestimated the amount of fat by a third to a half. In health-conscious Newport Beach, this was big news. This information made it into the local newspaper. After they repeated the analysis themselves and received a report confirming our lab's findings, they wrote a front-page article detailing everything they had learned. Of course, Sean made sure that even those who didn't read the article were kept in the loop via social media. Confrontation with Bastard. A couple months after my divorce, I decided it was time to visit Bastard. By then, I had gotten used to the models that Alex kept around all the time, and was dating a few of them myself. My social life, at least, wasn't suffering thanks to Alex. I invited one of the girls I had been dating, who in my estimation was the most attractive of the bunch, to dinner. I wanted to make a particularly good impression that evening, to have her with me and in my company. I told her of the significance of the evening to me, and she readily agreed to help me in any way she could. We went inside, and I looked around. This place brought back bittersweet memories for me. It had once held happy memories of me coming here with Andrea and the kids, when everything was still innocent, and Andrea was still my loving and faithful wife. But those memories were overshadowed by the fact that this was where she had first met an asshole, and this was where the final destruction of my family began. And there was no one else in the restaurant, even though it was lunchtime. Every time I'd been here in the past, the place was lively, and most of the tables were occupied. There were no employees in the restaurant, so we just walked in and took seats at a table in the center of the empty restaurant. Bastard must have heard the sound of the doorbell when we first walked in, because he came out a few seconds later to wait for us. I didn't remember there being a chime by the door before. I guess it was a substitute for the host or two hosts who always stepped forward to greet and receive incoming guests. Apparently, at this point, he was both host, waiter, and owner. I wondered if he had gone back to preparing the food. He didn't notice who I was as he casually glanced at me before focusing on my companion. I'm sure that working in the restaurant business, he saw familiar faces on a regular basis and paid no attention to my person. I looked up at him. "We'll take a couple glasses of water. You can use tap. I'd order food, but I've heard terrible things about this place. But I've never believed rumors, so I've come to check it out for myself." With those words, I looked around the empty restaurant. The asshole looked surprised at first, but to his credit, he quickly came to his senses. "Oh, that's Daniel, right? Where's Andrea and the kids?" The familiarity with which he mentioned my now ex-wife's name, and the fact that he even mentioned my kids, almost caused him to get a kick out of it. But I definitely wasn't going to let this piece of shit get to me. I was here to gloat over the victory. The fight was over. The war was already won, even if the loser was still standing on wobbly legs. "Tom, women come and go. I met Andrea when I was young and didn't have much going for me. Anyway, it was time to renew myself. Thanks to you, I was able to do that without feeling guilty about having to leave her." I looked at my companion at the word renewal. In terms of beauty, she probably surpassed Andrea. However, if Andrea hadn't done what she did, I would have chosen her over my companion without a second thought. A beautiful face and body is not an equal substitute for years of deep love and intimacy together. But business, that's a different matter. I hear you're not doing too well. I'd order something to eat, but like I said, I've heard terrible things about this place. Is that why it's so empty? Tom frowned, but managed to keep his composure, and thinking he had the upper hand, replied, "I think you're confused about something. I heard it was you who lost your business along with your wife. We're doing all right. You just came at a bad time." I confidently sat back down and said to the asshole with a smile on my face, "What you hear and what's true are two different things, Tommy boy. Andrea losing her share of the business is true, but that I lost business is greatly exaggerated." The way I said it must have made the asshole believe me, because his face turned sour and he looked like he was thinking. Our divorce was final, and although the divorce proceedings could be reopened if there was new evidence, I didn't think the comment I made to my wife's now ex-lover would be taken seriously by Andrea's lawyer or the court. Besides, there was too much factual evidence to the contrary. There's a big difference between believing something and trying to prove it in court. I didn't have anything else to say. I wanted to visit him again while he was clearly suffering and preparing to lose everything. I needed to see his once full and noisy restaurant, now empty and quiet. I needed to see the pain on his face. I also needed him to see the face of the man who had taken everything from him, just like he had tried to take everything from me. "I have to go now, Tommy. Next time, don't start a war with an opponent who is much smarter than you. Sun Tzu once said, 'Battles are won or lost before the battle even begins.' You were too stupid to realize that you couldn't win this war, and you didn't realize how much it would cost you. When you go back to working long hours behind a hot stove as a cook in someone else's restaurant, think about that and me, Tommy boy." I got up to leave, and this time the asshole threw me a baleful glare. I smugly smirked back at him, looked around and said, "I wonder what kind of restaurant will be here in a few months." I looked at my companion, who also stood up as I stood up, and with a smile on my face, I told her, "Whatever it is, we should definitely try it." With those words, I walked out feeling the asshole's stare behind me. The restaurant went on for another couple months. I heard that he lost all of his savings and borrowed extra money from friends and family to try and keep the restaurant afloat. This undermined many of his close relationships. I thought about how useless it is to throw good money at bad. It's like throwing money on fire. What kind of businessman would do that? 5 years later, and a look back, I ended up being right about Alex. After the divorce, he hired me as president of the company at a generous salary. In addition, after paying income taxes, he would send my share of the profits to an offshore account. By 2018, a year after the statute of limitations had expired to reopen the divorce proceedings, Alex concluded that I was a very important part of Odysseus Enterprises and therefore deserved a 50% stake in the company. This, of course, was the official public statement to the agreement we made back in 2013. Alex has also been a tremendous boon to the company. By 2018, thanks to our combined efforts, the company's revenues and profits had more than quadrupled, and the company was worth over $200 million. Saving most of Double O's existing customers wasn't that difficult. They didn't have a lot of time to find new suppliers, and even those who had already left hadn't had time to establish any meaningful relationships with them. They realized that what had happened was an anomaly, and that now that everything was cleared up, things would go back to normal. All payments to employees and our vendors were made first from the unfrozen Double O accounts, and then from funds that John Dalton had provided. For a time, suppliers required cash before shipping goods, but after a year, we were able to go back to purchasing on credit. I have always believed that I have an unusually high amount of energy and can fully function on only 4 hours of sleep. In Alex's case, I'm not sure he ever slept at all. We managed to buy John Dalton out. He had been getting his share of the profits for the last few years, and as a buyout, he agreed to 120% of the original funds he put into the new company. John was happy with the profit he made, but he did it mainly to help the two of us. So now Alex and I each owned 50% of Odysseus. I met and married a woman who herself had 2 children. All the kids got along with each other. She loved my kids and I loved hers. She and Andrea even became friends. I took Andrea's claims to heart, so I made a much greater effort to focus on this marriage as a separate entity from the children. Even though we now had 4 children instead of 2. But Beth, my new wife, was also different from Andrea. She seemed to need less from me than Andrea did. Perhaps it was because everyone was older, including Andrea, and needs change over time. Beth was almost 40 when I first met her, and Andrea was only 18 at the time. Andrea became a nurse a few years ago and is now a working mom. She started a relationship with a fellow nurse, and last year they got married. About 6 weeks before Andrea married John, I stopped by to pick up my kids late Friday night. John was waiting on the porch of my old house and came up to my car as I was getting out of it. He asked if he and I could have a drink and talk and get to know each other better. I must have looked at him strangely because he added, "If it was the other way around, I'd like to meet the person who will be living with my children." I looked over and saw Andrea standing on the porch with her arms crossed. She smiled and, obviously realizing what John was talking to me about, nodded at me. I nodded back, turned to John, and agreed to go with him. We headed to a local bar and grill, took booths at a back table, ordered a couple drinks and an appetizer. "Daniel, I want you to know a few things, and you can ask me anything you want. The first thing I want to say is that I will never, ever try to come between you and the kids. Quite the opposite. I will support your relationship any way I can. By the way, Andrea is not going to put up with anything less." She made that clear to me as soon as we started a serious relationship. "The only thing I ask is that I care about your children, and I don't want to be just a roommate to them. I don't want to be just someone they tolerate who happens to live with their mom. I'm not asking to be a second dad to them, but maybe a cool uncle or something. I think if you get to know me better, you'll realize that I'm not such a bad guy. And just to clear your mind, I don't have any criminal record. You can check me out. There's nothing there." I laughed. "John, I've already done a lot more than check your criminal record. As soon as I found out that you and Andrea had started a serious relationship, I gave you a full background check. Don't worry, you passed the check." No. John and I spent a couple of hours getting to know each other, and I realized that I liked him, and I was glad Andrea would end up with him. More than that, I trusted him around my kids. Andrea had not dated anyone between Bastard and John. Apparently, John was showing a lot of interest in Andrea at work, and she kept rejecting his advances. Late one night, a couple years before John and I met to get to know each other, Andrea came to my house. There was incessant knocking on the door until I finally opened it. When I opened it, I saw a sobbing, incoherent Andrea who stepped inside and immediately hugged me and clung to my chest as she continued to cry uncontrollably. I was beginning to worry that something had happened to the kids, but then Andrea finally squeezed out a short question between sobs. Daniel, do we have a chance to be together again? That caught me off guard. All this time, Andrea had been friendly to me every time I saw her when I picked up or dropped off the kids, but she had never once let me know that she was interested in us being together again. My immediate reaction was to say, I'm sorry, but no. Andrea still continued to hug me, resting her head against my chest. I felt her nod, and she began to try to pull herself together. She stayed in my arms for a few more minutes, crying quietly, and then finally pulled away a little and smiled at me. With sadness in her eyes and a forced smile on her lips, she told me she had to go and quickly left. I didn't think about that night for months. But when I did, it seemed to me that I had said no so quickly mostly because I didn't have the opportunity to say no to her the way she had said no to me. I guess the petty side of me woke up in me again, and my immediate reaction was to reject her as soon as the opportunity presented itself. Honestly, I don't know if my response would have been different, but I do know that I should have thought about it more than a quick knee-jerk reaction before making such a big decision. She was the love of my life at one time and is still the mother of my children. This was a chance to reunite our family again, and I brushed it off, not giving it the importance it deserved. By the time I had these thoughts, I was already seriously dating Beth, my current wife, and Andrea was dating John. Apparently, she was refraining from dating him or anyone else, hoping that in time I would forgive her and we would have a chance to be together again. A few days after my rejection, she accepted John's dating proposal, and now, a little over 2 years later, they were going to be married in a few weeks. When Andrea heard me park my car in her driveway after John and I returned from the bar, Andrea came out of the house and walked over to us. She slipped her right arm through my left and said to John, Babe, I'm going to take a quick walk with Daniel around the block, okay? He smiled and nodded. After that, Andrea and I set off walking and talking. So, come on, Daniel, what do you think? Are you and John doing well? Yes, Andrea, we're doing fine. He seems like a good guy. But I told him just in case I was wrong, that if he ever hurt you or the kids, there would be consequences. Andrea chuckled and looked at me with one eyebrow raised. About the kids? I don't doubt it. I don't either, do I? Yeah, you too, Andrea. We walked a few more steps in silence, and then Andrea turned to face me again, a smirk on her face. I heard you got your company back. Andrea said, got it back with air quotes. Yes, I got it back. Well, half, but yes, I got it back. Now it was my turn to do the air quotes. Andrea wept, You have no idea how happy I am, Daniel. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close to me. She sighed softly and relaxed completely in my arms. I can tell you that right now. My wedding gift to you and John is a house. I've already paid it off in full and I'm passing my share on to you. I think you and John can handle it, but just in case, I wanted to transfer everything into your name before you two get married. If Andrea had already wept at the news of my company, this news made her burst into tears. Andrea was much more emotional after the divorce than Andrea was before the divorce. It took a few minutes of holding her in my arms and quietly shushing her, trying to calm her down, before she started to pull herself together. I knew you loved the house, Andrea, but I didn't think you loved it that much. I said jokingly, trying to make her smile and brighten the moment. She pulled away from me, but still remained in my arms. She looked up at me and frowned incredulously. You think I reacted like that because of the house? You think I care that after the kids leave, John and I will have to sell the house and split the profits with you? Or even if you take all the profits and John and I move into an apartment, I'm paying because it means to me that you've finally forgiven me, Daniel. She looked at me hopefully and asked, Is that true, Daniel? Do you really forgive me? Honestly, I don't even know if I thought about forgiving you or not forgiving you, Andrea. I knew I didn't want to destroy you or anything. You're the mother of my children. At least I didn't want you in a bad position because it would hurt them. Besides, you know I'm not the type to wallow in anger or negative feelings. Investing in negative feelings isn't very profitable. And you know how much I hate bad investments, Andrea. I said the last one with a smile on my face, trying to lighten the mood. But yes, I forgive you, Andrea. I know I never said those words, but I thought it was obvious from the way I acted around you the past few years that I didn't hold bad feelings. I thought you were being on your best behavior so we could get along for the sake of the kids, Daniel. And I know you're not the type to hold on to negative feelings, Daniel. But there's a big difference between holding on to bad feelings and forgiving me. Andrea took a deep breath and added, God, I feel like I weigh 100 pounds less. Andrea, after the divorce, I felt like you should have gotten more than you did. Even if what happened hadn't happened and we divorced for a different reason, I didn't feel that a 50% split of double O would have been fair to me. If I had a decent job and you stayed home and took care of the kids, I would feel that my wife deserves half of the assets in a divorce. You may think I'm a jerk, but I don't think that regardless of the reason for our divorce, you deserve half of the double O. But you do deserve a decent minority percentage. I took the amount I thought it should be, and then subtracted a nice discount for the fact that things are over between us. At this point, the house should be worth at least $4 million. I think that's a pretty fair amount. She smiled, nodded, and said, That's more than fair, Daniel. Thank you. I smiled at the words, good discount. I no longer had any anger about the way things had ended between Andrea and me, and I wanted her to know that. With John and her owning the house and the generous alimony I was paying her, which was several times the amount of our divorce settlement, they should be able to save enough for retirement. While I felt it was fair to discount a certain amount for Andrea ending our relationship, I had another, less selfish and meaningful reason. Andrea had found her calling in nursing. She was passionate about what she did, and it gave her a purpose for her life outside of her children. I didn't want her to even be tempted to go back to idleness again. I pulled her to me again and hugged her tightly, and this time she began to cry quietly into my chest. When we got back to the house, I put my arms around Andrea's waist, pulling her close to me. John looked at her, and it was clear that she was crying. He looked at me with a raised eyebrow, and I told him it was okay. Andrea noticed this and smiled at John. She went over to him and gave him a hug and told him she would tell him everything later. I thought what John had done by asking to talk to me was such a great idea that I decided to do the same with my new wife's ex-husband. He turned out to be more hesitant than I was with John. It took a few more tries, and while we didn't become friends like John and I did, we were at least in the range from polite to friendly. And that's all I cared about. For all the adults to get along with each other for the sake of the kids. Andrea and I were getting along again, though now separately. We tried our best to shield the kids from the negative effects of the divorce. To be honest with myself, I think Andrea is happier now than she was with me. Perhaps happier isn't quite the right word. The point is that she is more content. Finding a career that's meaningful to her has contributed a lot to that. And John adored her. He would go to work, put himself out there, and afterward devote himself completely to her. She seemed to feel more comfortable and less anxious these days. Perhaps it was all due to maturity and age. We all get more and more comfortable as we age. I, too, learned from my mistakes with Andrea and made sure that the second time around, my wife and I had plenty of date nights and time alone with each other. Andrea and I married young and then found ourselves consumed with life and I with my company. I guess I was in survival mode from childhood and kept a laser focus on my business and career. We both learned valuable lessons and hopefully won't make the same mistakes again. And hopefully we are now wise enough to recognize other mistakes sooner and learn how to communicate better with our spouses. When I was married to Andrea, I took for granted that we would always be together. But each of us has a chance to turn things around, and it all depends on what you make of it. Who knows if I'd be happier if Andrea and I were back together? Or would Andrea have been happier? Once I made a decision, I always lived with it, and never looked back wondering what could have been. Besides, I was too damn busy to worry about such things. The end. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.